Hey everyone, welcome to this explainer. I'm so glad you're joining me today because we're going to dig into a truly fascinating and honestly a pretty shocking ancient text. We're looking at the 43rd chapter of the book of Jeremiah. Now, whether you're a longtime scholar of ancient literature or just someone who loves a good breakdown of complex historical and theological ideas, you are right where you need to be. We're going to unpack a narrative here that completely flips our traditional views on power, history, and divine authority right on their head. So let's jump right in.
All right, let's start with this incredibly jarring text from Jeremiah chapter 43, verse 10. The original text does something that totally disrupts our theological comfort zones. It gives a pagan monarch a sacred title. Just listen to how this reads. "Behold, I will send and take Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant." I mean, really think about the weight of those words for a second. This isn't just a casual passing mention. It is a deliberate, highly provocative choice of words that absolutely shatters the expected narrative.
And it immediately begs a massive central question, right? How in the world can a holy God call a heathen king his servant? This is the core paradox we'll be unpacking throughout this explainer. It's this profound mystery that really forces us to rethink the boundaries of divine sovereignty in these ancient scriptures. How does the account actually reconcile this? Well, let's break it down.
Section 1. A shocking biblical paradox.
So this paradox drops a really sobering theological truth right in our laps. God's sovereignty isn't boxed in by human righteousness. When the people in this narrative refuse to obey in the light, the divine will is still going to be accomplished, even if it means using the darkness of the world to do it. You see, when you hear the phrase servant of the Lord, you instinctively think of faithful covenant people, right? People like Moses, David, the Apostle Paul, men who really sought after the heart of God. But here, instead, we get Nebuchadnezzar, a pagan monarch, a completely ruthless conqueror, an idolater, and perhaps most shockingly to the original audience, the literal destroyer of Jerusalem who burned the holy temple to the ground. Yet he's the one getting the sacred title.
Section 2. The Rebellion of Judah.
Now, to understand exactly why Nebuchadnezzar was called into action like this, we need to quickly look at the historical background. Let's trace how this tragic rebellion unfolded chronologically. First, you have the absolute devastation of the fall of Jerusalem. Following that chaos, Gedaliah, the governor, gets assassinated. This completely spirals the remaining people into a panic. They are terrified of Babylonian retaliation. So in step 3, this terrified remnant goes to the prophet Jeremiah. They're desperate, begging him to pray for direction. And finally, despite the clear guidance they actually get, the whole thing culminates in step 4, they flee to Egypt.
But wait, let's look at the promise they made back in step 3 of that timeline. Before Jeremiah even gave them an answer, the remnant made this incredibly solemn vow. You can find it in Jeremiah 42:6. It says, "Whether it be good or whether it be evil, we will obey the voice of the Lord our God." They promised complete, total obedience to whatever direction God gave them through the prophet. They swore they'd follow it no matter what.
However, when Jeremiah actually comes back with the word of the Lord, which, by the way, explicitly told them to stay in the land, to trust God, and directly warned them not to go to Egypt, they do a complete 180. The record indicts them as proud men. Basically, their basic human survival instincts totally overrode their solemn promise. Because God's strategy didn't match the geopolitical analysis they had already cooked up in their heads, these proud men literally accused the prophet of lying. They didn't really want a sovereign command. They just wanted a rubber stamp for their plans they had already decided on.
And so, what do? They pack their bags and march straight down to Egypt. But why Egypt? Well, in this scriptural context, Egypt is super symbolic. It represents the old life. It stands for worldly security, human intellect, and just relying on fleshly strength. The text is brilliantly highlighting a very fundamental human instinct. When we're faced with intense trials, our default mechanism is almost always to run back to the false, worldly security of our past, rather than just standing still and trusting a higher plan.
Section 3. Hidden Stones of Judgment.
But here's the thing. Changing your geography doesn't mean you escape the consequences. The narrative shifts the scene to a place called Tahanahes. The people of Judah have stopped here, feeling perfectly safe right in the shadow of Pharaoh. But right there, God gives Jeremiah instructions to perform this bizarre, highly specific, and deeply symbolic sign act. Step 1. Jeremiah is told to take these great heavy stones in his hands. Step 2. He's commanded to hide them in the clay right in the brick kiln at the entryway of Pharaoh's house in Tahpanhes. And step 3.
He has to do all of this in plain sight of the men of Judah. Just picture that visual for a second. You have the prophet burying massive rocks in the mortar right at the entrance of the most powerful palace in the region, all while the fleeing refugees stand there watching him.
So the absolutely crucial point here is this. To the human eye, these just look like a bunch of rocks hidden under the pavement of an Egyptian palace. But the text reveals that God is marking the exact spot of inescapable judgment. God essentially declares, "Watch what I'm going to do. On these very stones, I will set the throne of Nebuchadnezzar." Think about that. The exact place Judah ran to for safety is exactly where their greatest fear is going to set up his throne.
Wow. And this brilliantly loops us right back to Nebuchadnezzar's title of servant. As Proverbs 21:1 points out, the king's heart is in the hand of the Lord. As the rivers of water, he turneth it whithersoever he will. Theologically speaking, calling Nebuchadnezzar a servant did not mean he was some converted saint, not at all. It meant he was an unwitting tool. He was literally a delivery boy of justice in the hands of the master builder. He thought he was marching for his own glory, his own ambition and empire. But the narrative frames him as simply fulfilling a divine decree to go fetch the rebellious people who honestly thought they could outrun God.
Section 4. The shattering of idols.
So let's see what happens when that unwitting servant actually arrives in Egypt. To really grasp the scale of this, we need to look at one of the specific targets mentioned in the text, Beth Shemesh. This translates to the house of the sun. It was the absolute epicenter of Egyptian sun worship, heavily fortified and packed with massive obelisks dedicated to the sun god Ra. This place represented the ultimate economic, spiritual, and military might. It was the exact impenetrable shield the Judeans mistakenly thought would protect them.
But the text tells us that when Nebuchadnezzar arrives, he completely, absolutely smites the land. He burns the temples to the ground and physically shatters the massive, supposedly eternal images of Beth Shemesh. Through this total devastation, the source material explains that God is showing his people a really harsh reality. The idols, the military might, the worldly securities they decided to trust instead of him, they're utterly bankrupt. When faced with divine judgment, all of it is reduced to nothing but wood, stone, and ash.
Section 5. The Master of History. Okay, so what does all this actually mean for the reader today? Well, our source distills this ancient narrative down into 3 distinct theological applications. Number 1, God is the uncontested master of history. Number 2, the stark contrast between willing versus unwitting service. And number 3, the sobering reality that there is simply no security outside of God's will. Let's look at each of these just a bit closer.
Expanding on that first point, the text offers an incredibly powerful reassurance. Look, we live in a world that often feels chaotic, right? Political leaders rise and fall, hostile forces surge, and it can definitely seem like things are just spiraling out of control. But this historical account reminds the reader that God holds the leash of history. He has the absolute authority to use anyone, anything, and any nation, even the modern Nebuchadnezzars of our day, to accomplish his ultimate will. He's got the whole thing mapped out. Control is literally never lost. And that brilliantly leads into our second takeaway. It's not really a question of if God's will is going to be done, it's a question of how you are going to participate in it. You can serve willingly, like a child, being faithful, obedient, and standing on the truth like Jeremiah did, even when it is deeply unpopular. Or you can serve unwittingly as a tool, blind, driven by your own pride, and ultimately facing judgment, exactly like Nebuchadnezzar. Both of them served a purpose, but obviously their positions were vastly, vastly different. Finally, let's drive home that third point. Judah fled to Egypt for safety, only to find that the very judgment they were running from was waiting for them right there at the border. The application here is incredibly direct. Fleeing to your own modern Egypt, whether that means finding false security in finances, relationships, or really any worldly safety net apart from God's will, it simply cannot stand. The overarching argument of this entire text is that the only truly safe place to be is right in the center of God's will. Which leaves us with this final, incredibly provocative question, drawn right from the heart of the text. If God is the master of history and his will is absolutely, for sure, going to be accomplished, what role are you going to play in it? Are you going to hide your own stones of rebellion and rely on your own strength, or are you going to serve willingly? It's such a fascinating reflection on ancient history and personal reliance, and I really hope it leaves you wanting to explore even more. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and as always, keep looking for the deeper structure behind the story.